The night had already settled over the lonely plains when Elijah Cole sat on the porch of his cabin, staring at the mountains like they owed him an explanation. His life had become a quiet battlefield ever since he lost his brother, the only family he cared to admit he needed. But tonight something different pressed against his chest, a letter he'd picked up from the post office, addressed to a Cole, but not the right one. He hadn't meant to open it, but the handwriting resembled his brother's, and for the first time in months, he felt something close to hope. Instead, the words hit him like a runaway stallion. "We're arriving next week. My daughter and I have nowhere else to go. Please keep your promise." His stomach tightened. Whoever wrote this believed they were coming to a man who owed them safety. That man was dead. The letter trembled in his hand as he reread it under the lantern glow, searching for some clue, some name that might help him understand the mix-up. It was signed by a widow named Mara Dawson, someone he'd never met, yet her words carried a weight that felt painfully familiar: desperation. Elijah leaned back, the old wood creaking beneath him as he imagined a woman and her daughter traveling alone across dangerous territory, expecting shelter from a ghost. He clenched his jaw. He could pretend it wasn't his problem. He could pretend he'd never opened the letter. But the idea of a widow wandering into the wilderness relying on a promise that couldn't be kept twisted something inside him. He'd seen too many lives swallowed by the frontier's cruelty to let another join the count. By morning, he saddled his horse, Blaze, more out of instinct than decision. The wind rolled across the prairie with a whisper that pushed him forward, urging him to find her before the land found her first. He tucked the letter into his vest, feeling its presence like a heartbeat against his ribs. He didn't know what she looked like. He didn't know how old the daughter was. All he had was a signature on paper and a fear that if he waited, he'd be too late. As he rode through the valley, dust rising behind him like a ghost trail, he tried to imagine what kind of woman would write a stranger with such fragile trust. Only someone pushed beyond her breaking point, he guessed. Someone like he once was. Hours later, he saw the stagecoach broken down by the river bend. The wheels were cracked, the horses missing, and beside the wreck sat a woman clutching a little girl, shielding her from the cold wind. Elijah slowed, feeling his pulse jump as the widow lifted her eyes toward him. Mara Dawson looked exhausted but proud, the kind of woman who refused to let the world see how much it had taken from her. Her daughter, no older than 8, shivered under a faded blanket. Elijah dismounted, unsure what to say, unsure how to explain he wasn't the man she expected. Yet when Mara's lips parted with relief, he couldn't bring himself to crush it. Not yet. She stood, smoothing her daughter's hair as she stepped forward, her voice trembling with guarded hope. "You must be Mr. Cole," she said, the words wrapped in gratitude. Elijah opened his mouth, but the truth tangled in his throat. He didn't want to lie, but he couldn't watch her crumble, not now, not while she was stranded and terrified. So he nodded once, a small, reluctant gesture, knowing it would cost him later. Mara's shoulders sagged as if a weight finally loosened. The little girl peeked out at him with big eyes that mirrored the uncertainty Elijah carried in his own. Something in him softened. Whatever they'd endured, they deserved a moment of safety. As he helped them gather what little they had, Mara explained that bandits had cornered the coach, taken the horses, and left them stranded. Elijah felt heat rise in his chest. Not anger at her, but at a world that preyed on the vulnerable. He loaded their bags onto Blaze, ignoring the bite of guilt that kept reminding him she believed he was someone else. Mara watched him with a quiet respect that made the life feel heavier. Yet when her daughter slipped her small hand into his, trusting him without hesitation, something broke inside him. He wasn't their promised protector, but he could be the one they needed today. As they walked toward his ranch, the sun dipped low, turning the plains gold as if blessing the fragile new bond forming between them. Mara moved with cautious grace, each step revealing a woman accustomed to loss but not defeat. Elijah kept glancing at her, noticing things he hadn't expected, the resolve in her posture, the fear hidden behind her endurance, and the way she kept placing herself between danger and her daughter. He admired her before he realized he was doing it. But the letter in his vest burned like truth waiting to burst open. By the time they reached his ranch, dusk had swallowed the sky. Mara exhaled softly, her eyes widening at the sight of the sturdy wooden cabin, the barn standing tall, the land stretching out like a quiet promise. It's more than I expected," she whispered. Elijah felt something twist inside him, not pride, but dread. She thought she had stepped into safety built for her. But it wasn't hers. It wasn't even supposed to be his responsibility. Yet as he watched her daughter run toward the porch with exhausted excitement, he knew he couldn't turn them away, no matter what truth waited ahead. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the fireplace wrapped around them, and Mara's rigid shoulders finally lowered. She helped her daughter settle on the cot Elijah set up, tucking the girl in with a tenderness that made his chest ache. He recognized that kind of love, the kind that fought everything, even fate. When Mara finally sat, her fingers trembling around a cup of warm tea he'd made, she looked at him with tired but grateful eyes. "You saved us today, Mr. Cole. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Elijah swallowed hard, the guilt creeping higher, threatening to choke him. He didn't deserve gratitude for a lie. As the hours passed, Mara shared pieces of her story, how her husband died in a mining collapse, how she struggled to protect her daughter from a world that kept taking and never giving. Elijah listened in silence, the steady crackle of the fire filling the space between their words. He couldn't help but admire her strength, the way she spoke softly but carried storms beneath her voice. Every confession she offered made his own truth harder to keep. He knew he should tell her before she grew more comfortable, but watching her daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in days made the words die on his tongue. When Mara stepped outside to breathe the night air, Elijah followed. The land stretched endlessly, stars glittering above them like scattered hope. She wrapped her shawl tighter, glancing at him with vulnerability she couldn't hide. "Your brother, he told me in his letter that this place was a refuge. That he owed my husband a life debt." Elijah froze. That was the missing link. His brother had written to her, had made a promise he died before fulfilling. Now Elijah understood why the widow came, why she trusted the name Cole. The truth hit him with a quiet, devastating clarity. He wasn't the Cole she was meant to find, but he was the only one left. The realization crushed him and yet bound him to her in a way he hadn't expected. His brother had believed in protecting this woman and her child. Maybe that was reason enough for Elijah to continue the deception, at least until he could figure out how to keep them safe. But before he could speak, Mara's voice cracked softly, "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there today." Elijah felt the confession slice him open. He wanted to tell her he wasn't her promise. But she looked at him with too much trust, too much hope, and he couldn't shatter her, not tonight. As they stood in the quiet night, the wind carrying the scent of pine and distant rain, Mara's daughter called softly from inside, asking if the cowboy man was staying nearby. Mara smiled faintly, and Elijah felt something warm spread across his chest. He looked at them, two strangers who already felt like a responsibility he hadn't asked for but somehow needed. He made a silent vow then, one that had nothing to do with the original misread letter. He would protect them, even if it meant breaking himself along the way. But fate wasn't done twisting the knife yet. Because just as Elijah was about to retreat inside, a shadow moved near the barn, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone had followed them, and they weren't here by accident. Elijah stepped forward, instinct sharpened by years of living on edge, his hand hovering near the revolver at his hip. The crunch of gravel under the stranger's boots echoed through the still night, and the barn's shadow stretched longer as the figure approached. Mara stood frozen behind him, clutching her daughter, fear tightening her breath. Elijah raised a hand silently, urging her to stay back while he moved toward the dark silhouette. Whoever the intruder was, they didn't bother hiding their presence. That meant confidence, or danger. When the figure finally stepped into the pale lantern light, Elijah felt the cold slide of recognition. It was one of the bandits who had ambushed the stagecoach. The man smirked, his eyes drifting past Elijah toward the cabin. "Didn't expect the widow to find herself a new guard dog so quick," he sneered. Elijah's jaw clenched. He didn't care what the man said about him, but the moment those greedy eyes lingered on Mara and her daughter, a violent heat pierced his chest. Elijah positioned himself between them and the intruder, voice low and dangerous. "You got one chance to walk away," he warned. The man laughed, revealing broken teeth and a lack of fear that meant he wasn't alone. As if on cue, two more shadows materialized near the fence line, closing in like wolves. Elijah's blood turned to ice. They hadn't just followed the widow, they'd come to take what they believed they were owed. Mara pulled her daughter inside, her trembling hands locking the door, her breath shaky as thunder grumbled across the horizon. Elijah stood tall, even as 3 armed bandits spread out before him. He didn't have the advantage of numbers, but he had something else, purpose. He wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for the fragile trust in the cabin behind him. "Whatever you're after," Elijah said, "you won't get it here." The leader spat into the dust. "We want the girl," he growled. "She saw our faces. And the widow, well, she's worth something too." Elijah's vision blurred with fury, not from fear but from a promise he hadn't meant to make but now couldn't walk away from. The storm above cracked with lightning as if the sky itself gasped. Elijah moved first. A single shot rang out, shattering the night. The bandits scattered, firing back as Elijah dove behind the water trough, adrenaline hammering through his veins. Splinters flew as bullets struck the barn wall. Mara watched through the cabin window, tears streaking her face as she pressed her daughter close, praying the cowboy who wasn't supposed to be their savior wouldn't fall defending them. Elijah reloaded quickly, every movement fueled by something deeper than duty. For the first time in years, he felt alive, fighting not for revenge or survival, but to protect something precious. The leader rushed the porch, believing Elijah pinned. But Elijah was already moving, sliding from behind the trough and tackling the man to the ground. They rolled through the dirt, fists slamming, boots digging into the earth. Elijah took a punch to the jaw but returned one twice as hard. The bandit groaned, reaching for his gun, but Elijah knocked it away and slammed his forearm across the man's throat. "You won't touch them," he growled, each word burning with conviction. The bandit's breath rattled as he lost consciousness. Elijah barely had time to catch his breath before the next two charged. A gunshot tore across the field, grazing Elijah's arm. Pain flared, but he pushed through it. He fired back, hitting one bandit in the leg, sending him collapsing with a howl. The last man hesitated, realizing the cowboy wouldn't stop until none of them stood. The thunder cracked again, rain beginning to fall in heavy sheets. Elijah stepped forward, soaked, bleeding, but relentless. "Leave," Elijah warned, "and don't ever come near this land again." The final bandit stared at him, weighing his chances, then scrambled backward and disappeared into the storm. The battle was over, but Elijah's legs nearly buckled. Exhaustion and pain tugged at him, yet he remained standing until he was sure the threat was gone. When he finally turned toward the cabin, Mara burst out the door, running through the rain with her daughter close behind. She dropped beside him, her hands trembling as they touched his wounded arm. Her voice cracked with fear and relief. "You could have been killed." Elijah shook his head weakly. "Didn't plan on it," he murmured. The little girl threw her arms around him, and the warmth of her tiny embrace nearly brought him to his knees. Mara lifted Elijah's chin, her eyes shimmering with something deeper than gratitude. But beneath that warmth lay curiosity. She had seen his hesitation earlier, the conflict in his eyes. She sensed a truth he hadn't told. Inside the cabin, she cleaned his wound, her fingers gentle yet firm, her silence growing heavier with each passing moment. Finally, she set the cloth down and looked at him with an expression that demanded honesty. "Elijah, you're not the man my husband wrote to, are you?" His breath caught. The moment he'd been running from pressed its weight against his ribs. He could lie. He could protect himself from the shame of admitting he wasn't the promise she was searching for. But after tonight, after almost dying for them, he couldn't build trust on a foundation of silence. Elijah inhaled shakily. "No," he whispered. "The man you were meant to meet was my brother. He died months ago." Mara froze, the truth slicing through her. She looked away, her shoulders trembling. The room felt colder instantly, as if the storm outside had seeped in. "So everything," she whispered, "every step we took toward this place, was based on a mistake." Elijah lowered his gaze. "A mistake I made worse by not telling you sooner." Tears welled in her eyes, hurt and betrayal intertwining. But before she could speak again, her daughter slipped her hand into Elijah's. "Mama, he saved us," the girl whispered. "He didn't have to. But he did." Mara pressed a hand over her mouth, torn between anger and the undeniable truth her daughter spoke. Elijah rose slowly, despite the pain slicing through his arm. "You can leave in the morning if you want," he said, voice heavy. "But until then, you're safe here. And I'll make sure no one ever comes near you again." He stepped outside into the fading storm, feeling the weight of their disappointment like a wound deeper than any bullet could leave. Mara watched him from the doorway, her heart twisting. He had lied, yes. But he had also fought like a man with everything to lose. She didn't know what to feel, only that walking away from him suddenly felt more complicated than arriving. Morning came soft and pale, painting the land in hues of gold. Mara found Elijah at the corral, leaning against the fence, his arm bandaged but his posture heavy. She approached slowly, her daughter trailing behind. Elijah didn't turn. He expected them to say goodbye. But instead, Mara's quiet voice drifted toward him, carrying surprising gentleness. "My husband once told me," she said, "that a man's worth isn't in his promises, but in his actions." Elijah finally looked at her, his guarded expression cracking. She stepped closer. "And last night, your actions spoke louder than any name ever could." Her daughter wrapped her arms around his waist, and Elijah felt something inside him, something long buried, finally breathe. Mara offered him a small, fragile smile. "We don't want to leave," she admitted softly. "Not if you don't want us to." Elijah's throat tightened. This time, he didn't hesitate. "I want you to stay." The wind swept gently across the ranch as if sealing the new chapter forming between them. Mara reached for his hand, the warmth of her touch anchoring him in a way no letter, no promise, no past ever had. For the first time in years, Elijah felt like his life wasn't defined by silence or loss, but by something he hadn't dared imagine: hope. A misread letter hadn't brought a burden into his life. It had brought purpose, family, and a chance to rewrite a future he thought had been stolen from him long ago. As the widow and her daughter stood beside him beneath the rising sun, Elijah Cole realized something simple and profound. Fate had delivered them to the wrong man. But maybe, it had been the right man all along.